Every so often, a machine rolls into the world looking like a placeholder for something bigger, almost temporary in its simplicity, almost out of step with whatever trend is roaring past it. You see the lines and think they belong to a different decade, maybe even a different generation altogether. The materials look too honest, the layout too straightforward, the purpose too unbothered by fashion to ever be called modern. Yet instead of fading, it lingers. It survives new technologies, new competitors, new regulations, and even the collapse or rebirth of the company that built it. Rivals get sleeker, faster, or louder, only to disappear into brochures and scrap yards, while this unassuming relic keeps finding buyers who connect with it in ways marketing departments could never plan for. It becomes a benchmark not because it dominates on paper, but because it refuses to go away, adapting just enough to stay alive while never surrendering the character that made it recognizable in the first place. Like and subscribe, then drop a comment with the next machine you want covered. The Moto Guzzi V7 began as a pragmatic response to uncertainty, and its story opens in the mid-1960s when the company realized it needed something substantial to secure its future. Within the first few years of its development, Moto Guzzi understood that the V7 had to serve multiple audiences: domestic riders, international export markets, and institutions like police departments and government agencies that required reliability above all else. The engineers had neither the budget nor the luxury to reinvent the wheel, so they turned to something proven: a transverse V-twin with shaft drive, simple fuel delivery, and an emphasis on mechanical accessibility. At a glance, the Moto Guzzi V7 did not scream innovation the way newer, flashier motorcycles from abroad were beginning to do. But its wider ambitions were rooted in endurance rather than spectacle. The immediate goal was to produce a motorcycle that could handle sustained long-distance use without needing frequent attention, and that meant picking components and layouts that emphasized stability and ease of maintenance. In post-war Italy, many manufacturers were struggling to keep up with increasing competition from Japan and larger European firms, and Moto Guzzi was no different. The V7's designers selected a 90-degree V configuration positioned transversely across the frame to improve cooling and simplify drivetrain packaging. That choice was not made for aesthetics or novelty. It was about making a powertrain that could stay cool under pressure and transmit torque efficiently without the complexity of chains or belts. The shaft drive solved multiple issues at once by eliminating messy lubrication routines and extending the intervals between service, a crucial benefit for police departments and fleet buyers who needed consistent uptime. Many riders at the time were used to chain drive and didn't immediately grasp the benefit of this layout, but Moto Guzzi was confident that long-term ownership would prove its worth. Another key aspect of the early Moto Guzzi V7 lay in its frame construction and suspension tuning. Rather than chase sport performance, the frame was designed with stability and comfort in mind, two traits crucial for touring and utility use. The tuning of the suspension was not overly soft, but it prioritized composure on uneven or poorly maintained roads. Italian infrastructure varied widely from region to region, and a motorcycle that could tolerate rough surfaces without excessive wear would stand out to both solo riders and civic buyers. The decision to launch the Moto Guzzi V7 during a period of change in consumer expectations was bold, because many thought the future of motorcycles belonged exclusively to high-revving multi-cylinder machines. Yet the leadership at Moto Guzzi recognized that there would always be a market for a motorcycle built around torque, mechanical longevity, and a distinctive sound. The motorcycle's styling was understated compared to some of its contemporaries, but even that restraint served a functional purpose. Parts could be replaced without complicated bodywork to remove. Signals, seats, and handlebars could be adapted to different use cases with minimal re-engineering, and the broad silhouette of the engine gave the bike a recognizable stance that became a visual signature. In the United States, the introduction of the Moto Guzzi V7 coincided with a growing interest in European motorcycles that offered an alternative to both the domestic V-twin market and the rising tide of Japanese imports. American riders who encountered the V7 often discovered it through law enforcement fleets or touring enthusiasts who valued its low-end torque and durability. That exposure contributed to a slow but steady appreciation for the machine's qualities. What set the Moto Guzzi V7 apart from many offerings of its era was the way it balanced utility with character. It was neither bland nor ostentatious. It didn't promise to outrun anything, but it promised to keep running. That promise became the foundation for its survival. Early adopters discovered they could rack up significant mileage with fewer mechanical surprises And the ease of valve adjustments and maintenance routines made it friendly to riders who enjoyed working on their own machines. At a time when some manufacturers were beginning to integrate styling elements that prioritized appearances over service access, the V7 maintained an old-school logic in its construction. Behind the scenes, Moto Guzzi was not immune to financial and managerial challenges. The company had to stretch every investment as far as possible, so the Moto Guzzi V7 wasn't just a product, it was a platform. The air-cooled twin could be enlarged, detuned, or slightly reworked without overhauling the entire motorcycle, and that modularity gave the series a resilience that few competitors possessed. As regulatory frameworks evolved and emissions requirements began to tighten, the Moto Guzzi V7's drivetrain could be adapted incrementally, buying time for the brand to stabilize its finances. In many ways, the creation of the Moto Guzzi V7 was an act of long-term thinking in a short-term crisis era. When the first units entered service, riders didn't yet realize they were witnessing the beginning of a lineage that would carry Moto Guzzi through several ownership transitions and industry earthquakes. They simply saw a machine with a strong backbone and a distinct personality. The early years of production established a reputation that widened the bike's appeal, bridging the gap between utilitarian use and private ownership. Some riders appreciated the bike's calm, anchoring presence at speed, while others grew attached to the subtle vibrations and soundtrack of the transverse V-twin. Moto Guzzi's engineers capitalized on lessons learned from racing and prototype development when designing the V7, but they resisted the urge to turn it into a pure performance machine. The result was a motorcycle with enough power for open-road touring, enough strength for sidecar duty if required, and enough character to earn a following that ignored spec sheet comparisons. The essence of the Moto Guzzi V7 in its formative years lay in its refusal to be rushed into obsolescence. As other manufacturers pursued more cylinders, higher revs, and tighter bodywork, the V7 retained a kind of mechanical honesty that attracted buyers who preferred straightforward reliability. Some skeptics predicted the bike would vanish as soon as flashier models captured headlines. But each year, the V7 found new buyers who discovered that minimal fuss and consistent performance offered a different kind of satisfaction. That slow accumulation of goodwill helped cement the model's place in markets far from the streets of Mandello del Lario. What matters in the origin story of the Moto Guzzi V7 is not just the engineering, but the intent behind it. Moto Guzzi knew it couldn't compete head-to-head with the biggest manufacturers in every segment, so it focused on the strengths that define the brand: durability, distinct mechanical character, and adaptability. The first phase of the V7's life laid the groundwork for everything that followed, and those decisions made in the 1960s echo through every later iteration. Understanding how this motorcycle came to exist explains why it endured, and why it continues to carry the brand's identity into new eras. That foundation would be tested by the competitive and cultural shifts that reshaped the motorcycle industry in the decades that followed. The Moto Guzzi V7 moved into its next phase of relevance once it proved it could survive in a market increasingly dominated by high-performance imports and shifting consumer expectations. And the story of how it adapted without losing its core identity reveals the scale of the challenge. At the start of this period, the Moto Guzzi V7 was competing against a flood of machines from another manufacturer that offered more cylinders, higher revs, and sleeker appearances, often at similar or lower price points. The European market was fragmenting, and the United States was absorbing bikes that promised excitement and speed rather than mechanical endurance. Yet the Moto Guzzi V7 held its ground through practicality and rider loyalty, and its air-cooled twin could be enlarged and tuned to meet rising displacement expectations without abandoning its shaft-driven layout. That adaptability gave dealers and importers multiple configurations to offer without bloating development costs, and it reassured existing owners that their bikes would not become unsupported or obsolete overnight. The escalating stakes became especially clear when regulatory demands and emission standards tightened. While some manufacturers scrambled to develop entirely new engines, Moto Guzzi modified the Moto Guzzi V7 platform with updated carburation or fuel delivery systems, revised ignition timing, and incremental internal refinements. These changes did not produce headline-grabbing power figures, but they extended the model's viability and kept it compliant with market rules. In an era when some rivals retired models rather than update them, the continuity of the Moto Guzzi V7 stood out. It wasn't only regulations that threatened its existence. Economic instability, changing ownership structures, and the challenge of marketing a motorcycle that didn't fit neatly into a specific performance segment all could have ended the line. When larger corporate groups took control of the brand at various points, the Moto Guzzi V7 remained an anchor model, a known quantity that could be sold steadily while more experimental projects came and went. The bike became a kind of insurance policy for the manufacturer, reliable income from a loyal customer base without excessive overhead. Rider communities played a significant role in sustaining interest. Enthusiasts who owned early versions of the Moto Guzzi V7 embraced its mechanical accessibility, sharing customizations, maintenance tips, and touring stories through clubs and informal gatherings. That grassroots support built an ecosystem around the bike, enabling used models to keep circulating and strengthening resale values. Independent mechanics familiar with the platform further encouraged ownership by providing service options outside official networks. These dynamics reinforce the idea that the Moto Guzzi V7 was not a disposable product, but a long-term companion. In the United States, the Moto Guzzi V7 carved out a niche among riders who wanted an alternative to heavyweight cruisers and high-strung sport machines. It appealed to those who enjoyed the feel of a traditional engine configuration and the stability of shaft drive, but who didn't necessarily want excessive bulk or complexity. Touring riders appreciated the smoothness at highway speeds, while city riders valued the bike's narrow profile and distinctive style. Though sales volume never rivaled the biggest names, the Moto Guzzi V7 developed a presence that was greater than its numbers. As the motorcycle press evolved and retro aesthetics gained attention, the Moto Guzzi V7 benefited from its consistency. What once seemed old-fashioned began to feel authentic at a time when many bikes were adopting plastic bodywork and digital-heavy dashboards. Reviewers began to highlight the bike's character, its torque delivery, and its ability to connect riders with the road in a more tactile way. Owners often commented on the personality of the engine and the satisfaction of riding something that didn't chase trends. That perception strengthened the brand's confidence in keeping the platform alive. Incremental updates continued across generations. Changes in displacement from 700 to 750 and beyond, adjustments in frame geometry, refinements in brakes and suspension. Yet the silhouette remained recognizable, and the transverse twin remained the visual and mechanical centerpiece. These evolutions allowed the Moto Guzzi V7 to satisfy newer riders without alienating purists who valued continuity. The aftermarket also expanded, with accessories for touring, commuting, customization, and even mild performance enhancements. Each wave of restyling intersected with cultural shifts. During times when minimalist design and vintage cues were popular, the Moto Guzzi V7 looked like a conscious statement rather than a relic. When technology-heavy machines dominated advertising, the V7 offered a contrasting identity grounded in analog simplicity. That tension generated curiosity among riders who didn't fit the usual categories, giving dealers a conversation piece. What could have made the Moto Guzzi V7 obsolete ended up sharpening its appeal. The widespread assumption that it was outdated pushed the brand to refine the bike in ways that preserved its essence. Instead of chasing incremental horsepower, they emphasized balance, handling stability, and long-distance capability. By continuing to develop the Moto Guzzi V7, the manufacturer created a through line connecting the past to emerging markets that valued narrative as much as performance. Motorsports also played a subtle role. While the Moto Guzzi V7 was never a dominant racing platform compared to full competition machines, its architecture informed other models that achieved success in endurance events and police competitions. That association reinforced its toughness and gave marketing teams real-world credibility points without distorting the bike's purpose. The more the model proved itself in demanding conditions, the easier it was to justify its ongoing presence. Cultural impact within Italy and abroad added another layer. Riders saw the Moto Guzzi V7 as a symbol of national industrial perseverance, a machine that embodied local craftsmanship and design sensibility. International owners adopted that viewpoint, treating the bike as a connection to a specific heritage. When ownership of the brand changed hands and production methods evolved, the V7 remained a visual link to the company's origins. The longer it stayed in production, the stronger that symbolism became. The presence of the Moto Guzzi V7 across decades created a dynamic where nostalgia and practical value intersected. Vintage models circulated among collectors and everyday riders alike, and newer iterations benefited from the aura created by their predecessors. This kind of feedback loop meant that each generation didn't need to redefine the platform. It needed only to update it responsibly. Eventually, the Moto Guzzi V7 became one of those rare machines that straddled multiple eras without being pigeonholed. By the time manufacturers realized there was a resurgence of interest in retro-styled machines with modern reliability, Moto Guzzi already had a head start. The V7 had not been resurrected or reimagined from scratch. It had simply never gone away. That longevity gave the brand leverage when positioning new versions against competitors who were introducing imitations of their own histories. The continuation of the Moto Guzzi V7 through these transitional decades shows the momentum a platform can build when its core identity remains intact. Every threat, economic downturns, technological leaps, cultural shifts, narrowed the field of survivors, and yet the V7 found a way to evolve. It faced skepticism for being too slow, too simple, or too dated, but each critique became an opening to reposition the bike for riders who were unimpressed by short-lived fads. Today, understanding how the Moto Guzzi V7 navigated those obstacles reveals why it still resonates. Its endurance was not an accident, or the result of nostalgia alone. It was engineered into the architecture and sustained by the choices of riders who recognized its value. The payoff of that persistence becomes clearer when examining its modern role and legacy in the current marketplace. The Moto Guzzi V7 entered its modern chapter with a combination of momentum and scrutiny, and its evolution into this contemporary role sheds light on how a legacy machine survives in a world dominated by electronics, emissions mandates, and changing rider expectations. Within the first few updates of the new era, the Moto Guzzi V7 maintained its transverse V-twin layout and shaft drive, signaling to loyalists that the essence of the bike would not be abandoned. Yet beneath the familiar surface, the manufacturer began integrating features that addressed safety standards and environmental regulations. Fuel injection replaced carburetors, ignition systems became more precise, and components like brakes and suspension saw incremental improvements. The key was modernization without erasure, allowing the platform to satisfy both regulatory bodies and riders accustomed to analog charm. As the new millennium progressed, many manufacturers introduced retro-styled motorcycles meant to evoke heritage without being tied to continuity. The Moto Guzzi V7 differentiated itself by being an unbroken lineage rather than a revival. This gave it credibility among enthusiasts who valued authenticity over imitation. The simplicity of the engine, the approachable ergonomics, and the distinct sound all contributed to a riding experience that felt rooted in decades of refinement. At the same time, updates to instrumentation, lighting, and build quality brought it in line with modern expectations without overshadowing its identity. In the United States, the Moto Guzzi V7 gained attention as a viable entry point for riders who wanted something unique without excessive displacement or weight. It occupied a space between large touring machines and stripped-down commuter bikes, offering an alternative to mainstream segments. Riders drawn to air-cooled twins but unwilling to commit to bulkier options found the V7 approachable, customizable, and rich in character. Its presence in dealerships helped reintroduce the Moto Guzzi brand to American buyers who had only heard of it in passing or associated it with police use. The economic implications of continuing the Moto Guzzi V7 also influenced its trajectory. Because the engine and frame architecture could be adapted without extensive retooling, the brand could offer multiple trims and cosmetic variations without inflating production costs. Limited editions, special finishes, and accessory packages kept interest fresh. This approach let the bike respond to shifts in taste, whether retro minimalism, cafe styling, or touring comfort, while keeping the core mechanical layout intact. That strategy helped it survive periods when global demand for classic-style bikes fluctuated. As rider demographics changed, the Moto Guzzi V7 gained relevance with new generations who wanted a motorcycle that felt mechanical and engaging rather than insulated by electronics. The bike's modest power output encouraged riders to explore torque and rhythm instead of chasing speed, and its size made it manageable in urban and rural settings alike. Ownership stories began to circulate through online communities, mirroring the word-of-mouth culture that sustained earlier versions. Maintenance experiences, customization builds, and long-distance rides reinforced the idea that the V7 could be both a first bike and a lifelong companion. The environmental and regulatory landscape forced additional refinements. Emission standards in Europe and North America required cleaner combustion and better fuel management, so the manufacturer upgraded internal components and exhaust systems accordingly. Each iteration balanced these demands with the need to keep the engine's personality intact. While some purists lamented the loss of certain mechanical noises or quirks, the overall preservation of the layout reassured the core audience. The modern Moto Guzzi V7 also became a talking point in discussions about the future of air-cooled engines. As more brands prepared to phase out traditional designs in favor of liquid cooling and hybrid technologies, The persistence of the V7 raised questions about what riders truly wanted. Its continued existence suggested that not everyone needed maximum output or cutting-edge electronics to enjoy motorcycling. The bike represented a different value system, one where heritage, feel, and mechanical transparency mattered as much as performance figures. By the time newer iterations arrived with increased displacement and updated internals, the Moto Guzzi V7 had already secured its place as a cornerstone model for the brand. These upgrades addressed concerns about power and cruising ability without compromising the original character. Riders could now travel longer distances with greater comfort, and reliability improved further without losing the tactile qualities that defined the experience. Part of the enduring appeal lay in the fact that the Moto Guzzi V7 never pretended to be something it wasn't. It did not chase racing pedigree it didn't have, and it didn't try to outdo other categories and specifications it wasn't built for. Instead, it leaned into its strengths: ease of maintenance, recognizable silhouette, and balanced handling. That self-awareness made it easier for the manufacturer to market the bike honestly, and for riders to form emotional attachments to it. In the final analysis of its evolution, the Moto Guzzi V7 demonstrates that longevity in the motorcycle world often depends on clarity of identity and strategic adaptation. The bike weathered economic swings, corporate restructurings, and cultural shifts not because it ignored them, but because each change was accommodated without sacrificing the attributes that made the model distinct. The platform became a constant in a brand that experienced upheavals, and that consistency attracted both nostalgic owners and new riders searching for authenticity. The path forward for the Moto Guzzi V7 remains open. Even as talk of electrification and stricter emissions regulations grows louder, the model's legacy provides a foundation for whatever comes next. Whether future versions remain combustion-based or evolve into new formats, the heritage behind the name ensures its influence will continue. The motorcycle did more than survive. It defined how a company with limited resources could stay relevant by betting on character over conformity. Its impact reaches beyond its displacement and specifications, and the next step in its journey reflects everything it has already overcome. The Moto Guzzi V7 has earned an enduring place in the American market because its appeal rests on traits that translate across decades. And for US riders considering ownership today, context and expectation matter as much as nostalgia. The Moto Guzzi V7 appears early in any discussion about approachable, character-rich motorcycles because it bridges the gap between classic feel and modern usability. Pricing in the United States tends to fall below heavyweight cruisers and premium retro imports, yet it carries European cachet and distinctive mechanical identity. For buyers searching the used market, earlier examples range widely in condition and trim, with many still on the road thanks to the durability of the shaft-driven platform and the availability of parts through independent suppliers and specialty shops. Maintenance on the Moto Guzzi V7 remains relatively straightforward for those familiar with basic mechanical work. And even new owners with modest technical confidence can learn routine service with patience and guidance. The air-cooled twin offers access to valve adjustments without buried components, and the lack of complex bodywork means fewer surprises during upkeep. Over time, the engine updates addressed most of the reliability concerns associated with earlier carbureted versions, and modern iterations tend to run cleanly with minimal fuss. That said, prospective owners should be aware that dealership networks in the United States are not as dense as those supporting larger brands. So parts ordering and expert service may require planning depending on location. Enthusiast communities, both physical and digital, help fill those gaps. Forums, rider groups, and parts co-ops keep information circulating and reduce the intimidation factor for first-time buyers. Owners often share compatibility tips across model years, which further extends the value of used bikes. The aftermarket supports a range of accessories, including saddlebags, windscreens, suspension upgrades, and cosmetic conversions. This flexibility allows the Moto Guzzi V7 to occupy roles from daily commuter to tourer to cafe-style custom without losing its identity. For riders thinking about long-distance use, fuel economy, and manageable weight, make the Moto Guzzi V7 a compelling travel partner. Highway stability is sufficient for sustained cruising, and engine updates over the years improve torque delivery and smoothness. Seat comfort varies by trim, so buyers may look at aftermarket options if planning extensive riding. Insurance rates in the US tend to be moderate thanks to the bike's displacement, power output, and non-aggressive reputation. From a resale perspective, well-maintained Moto Guzzi V7 models hold their value better than many niche European motorcycles because the nameplate commands loyalty and turnover rates are relatively low. Newer buyers are often drawn in by the visual continuity across generations and the sense of heritage embedded in the design. The ongoing availability of fresh models means the used market benefits from parts carryover and brand visibility. The legacy of the Moto Guzzi V7 also resonates culturally among riders who reject the idea that every motorcycle needs to chase performance metrics. Its story, surviving ownership changes, economic strain, and shifting tastes, embodies the concept of resilience through identity. That message appeals to younger riders looking for authenticity and older riders returning to motorcycling with refined expectations. It is a platform that does not beg for explanation. Its presence tells its own story. Even as electrification and tighter emission controls loom, the Moto Guzzi V7 sets a precedent for how a classic layout can be modernized without losing its soul. Whether future models retain combustion or evolve into hybrid concepts, the architecture and heritage behind the name influence how the brand will approach that transition. For those considering ownership now, the bike's trajectory provides reassurance that it will not be abandoned abruptly. In practical terms, the Moto Guzzi V7 rewards riders who appreciate engagement over spectacle, and its measured evolution ensures accessibility without sacrificing character. The payoff of its long survival is a motorcycle that stands as both artifact and option, an heirloom that still belongs on the road. In the end, the most compelling fact about the Moto Guzzi V7 is not that it avoided extinction, but that it became stronger because everyone assumed it wouldn't.